Sevi. Welcome to my Jade guide, where we'll be covering Jade's kit and gameplay, Eidolons, Relic and Light Cone builds, team synergies, tips, and more to help you better understand her credit system. And a quick note that the footage and testing here is from the creator experience server, so there may still be some changes in the final version update, but they should be very minor if ever. With that, let's get started.
It's time for a lesson.
Jade is a 5-star Quantum Erudition character who specializes in AoE damage mainly through her follow-up attack and debt collector mechanics. Her kit is fairly straightforward, so let's review it before you agree to her terms and conditions. To start, Jade's basic attack is unique because it's the first unenhanced basic attack to deal blast damage to enemies. It's fitting of an Erudition character, and there's a good reason why, which we'll learn soon. Moving on, Jade's skill targets a party member to give them the debt collector status for 3 turns. The duration only counts down at the start of Jade's turn, so no need to worry about it disappearing too soon if a target ally moves really fast. She cannot reuse her skill as long as debt collector is active, so her rotation is fixed with a skill and 2 basic attacks to permanently maintain the debt collector effect. This also at least makes her an SP positive unit. The ally affected by debt collector gets a 30 speed buff because you need to be fast when chasing someone's debts after all, and when they attack they will deal additional quantum damage to each enemy hit and consume 2% of their max HP, though they cannot die from the HP drain. This additional quantum damage scales on Jade's attack, and any type of attacking actions will trigger this. Meanwhile, the HP drain mechanic is appropriate given Jade's dangerous contracts. This can be fairly negligible as long as you have a sufficient sustain or can finish the fight quickly enough. Moreover, this HP drain can synergize with effects that trigger by losing HP, such as Blade's passive or possibly relevant simulated universe buffs. And with her Ascension 4 ability unlocked, Jade gets a 50% action advance at the start of battle, making it almost always that she can apply the debt collector status before your preferred target ally acts. But the most important function of the debt collector status is to enable Jade's follow-up attack mechanic. After Jade herself or a debt collector ally attacks, Jade gains 1 charge for each enemy that was hit. Upon reaching 8 charge stacks, she consumes those 8 to launch an AoE follow-up attack. Even if she goes over 8, the excess stacks will carry over, so there's no wastage. Though do note that the attack itself does not generate charge stacks. This comprises a significant portion of her damage, and her main gameplay loop is about recharging those stacks for her to continuously dish out her follow-up attack. Since the stacks gained depend on how many enemies get hit, she also synergizes more with allies that have multi-target attacks, and more so against a lot of enemy targets. And thanks to her debt collector speed buff helping her ally move faster, that can consequently help her gain stacks faster as well. It also nicely helps that her basic attack is a blast attack. Now you might be thinking of targeting Jade herself to be the debt collector, which you can technically do. This does make her own basic attack and ultimate generate double the charge stacks, since they have their own innate stacking plus the debt collector effect. However, she does not gain the speed buff or trigger the HP consumption effect. While you generally do want it on another ally who can act more frequently, and since only other allies can activate the speed buff, there are still niche team setups where Jade acts as the debt collector. We'll get to those later. In relation to her follow-up attack mechanic, her ultimate is pretty straightforward. It's a 140 energy cost ability that deals AoE damage, which also helps her gain charge stacks. After her ultimate, she significantly enhances her talent's follow-up attack damage multiplier, which can trigger twice for even bigger AoE follow-up attack damage. And to further buff her damage, Jade has the Pawned Asset mechanic as well. Pawned Asset is a stackable buff, and each stack increases her crit damage, which can stack up to 50 times and lasts permanently in a battle. At level 10, that's 2.4% crit damage per stack, so this can reach up to a huge 120% crit damage bonus. And when you unlock her Ascension 6 bonus ability, each Pawned Asset stack increases Jade's attack by 0.5% or 25% at max stacks. Gaining Pawned Asset stacks is fairly convenient. First, her own follow-up attack gives her 5 stacks. Then when you unlock her Ascension 2 bonus ability, Jade gains 1 Pawned Asset stack when enemy targets enter combat, which is especially useful in pure fiction. And when the debt collector ally's turn starts, Jade gains 3 Pawned Asset stacks. Her technique also gives 15 Pawned Assets to start within battle. Casting it inflicts blind fealty in an area for 10 seconds. Enemies affected will not attack, and entering combat unaffected enemies will deal quantum damage to all enemies and make Jade gain 15 Pawned Asset stacks at the start. That's a potent buff for her crit damage and attack, and it can be easy to quickly ramp up to max stacks with synergistic setups. For her minor stat bonus traces, she gets useful attack and quantum damage bonuses and some effect resistance to help prevent debuffs. Prioritize her talent level to increase her follow-up damage, which will be her main damage source. This is followed by her ultimate, then skill. She does use her basic attack in her rotations, but it's still the lowest priority. All in all, we can see that her main gameplay loop revolves around unleashing her AoE follow-up attacks as frequently as possible and boosting them with her ultimate and her own self buffs. And through her debt collector allies, she can deliver additional damage and stack her charges faster. The charge stacking is best maximized with an ally that can both attack frequently and deal blast or AoE attacks, since the charge stacks are counted per enemy hit. Pure Fiction or any such similar combat scenarios is easily her playground, and she becomes so busted when you get her attack loop going with her ideal allies. We'll discuss more team synergies later on. Now let's take a look at her Eidolons, with her first Eidolon bringing the most impactful change. E1 gives her talent's follow-up attack a permanent damage buff, but more importantly, it reworks her charge stacking mechanic. When the debt collector attacks and only hits 2 or 1 enemies, Jade gains an additional 1 or 2 charge stacks respectively. This makes it so that she can always get at least 3 charges even versus 1 or 2 enemies, which helps a lot in charging her follow-up attack when it would be much slower in such combat scenarios at E0. Allies that are only single target attackers are now much more effective with her, so if you really want her to be more flexible, both in combat scenarios and team options, that's what her E1 is for. The rest of her Eidolons are quite simple. E2 gives crit rate if there are 15 pawned asset stacks, E3 increases her skill and talent levels, E4 makes her get a 12% defense ignore buff for 3 turns after using her ultimate, E5 increases her ultimate and basic attack levels, and lastly, with E6, Jade can now also act as a debt collector as long as there's another debt collector ally, because what's scarier than 1 debt collector? 2 debt collectors. This doubles her charge stacking capabilities without having to target herself anymore. It also gives her a 20% quantum resistance penetration bonus for overall higher damage. Now let's move on with her relic build, starting with her stats, which is a conventional crit DPS build. For the body, you'll most likely want crit rate. She already gets a ton of crit damage from her pawned assets, so it's best to balance that with good crit rate. Aim for at least 70% crit rate and 100% crit damage without her pawned asset buff yet. If ever you do get a lot of crit rate from substats, sets, light cone external buffs, or her E2, then it's possible to go for a crit damage body instead. For her feat, you generally want attack percent. In her general team setups, her follow-up attacks charge stacking can be carried by her debt collector allies action frequency, so trading attack for speed can be worth it to hit harder. However, speed is still an option depending on your speed tuning preferences or if you have specific setups in mind. For the sphere, you can go either quantum damage or attack. Their difference is mainly dependent on how they help balance other damage percent or attack sources and buffs and the substat quality of the piece. For the rope, go for attack percent. For substats, prioritize crit and attack. Speed rolls are optional if you're aiming for breakpoints or tuned setups. Moving on to her Relic and Planar sets. For her best full sets, it's either the Ash Blazing Grand Duke or Genius of Brilliant Stars. Grand Duke gives a 20% follow-up damage bonus and a stacking attack bonus based on how many hits the user's follow-up attack deals. Jade's follow-up attack is a multi-hit attack, with each enemy receiving 5 hits, so that's 5 stacks per enemy hit. So as long as she's hitting at least 2 enemies, she'll max the stacks. The Genius set is similarly competitive versus quantum weak enemies, as it gives a quantum damage bonus and 20% defense ignore against quantum weak enemies, but only 10% against non-quantum weak enemies. So its full potential is versus quantum weaknesses, and stacking other defense ignore and shred effects also make the damage increase more potent. Between these, the Grand Duke can be more preferable for universal application since it doesn't have that weakness requirement effect, and you'll be using Jade in multi-target fights anyway. But regardless, if you already have a good set of one or the other pre-farmed, you can stick with that. If you're considering the more recent Wind Soaring Valorous set, and if you farmed it along with the Break Effect set, it's technically still viable as it gives attack and crit rate buffs, but note that its damage buff only affects the user's ultimate, so it's not as well tailored as the previous sets. For more convenience or as a temporary build, you can go for 2-piece combos of attack, quantum damage, Grand Duke for a follow-up damage bonus, or even Pioneer with debuff for allies, and just choose your pieces with the right main stats and best substats. Then as for her Planar Ornaments, the performances of the top recommended ones are quite close, so it ultimately boils down to a substat game and which is more efficient to farm for you. Just note that Durant prefers having another follow-up attack teammate for faster buff stacking, Sigonia is more suited for Pure Fiction, and Izumo needs another Erudition teammate to unlock the crit rate buff. Now for her light cone options, there are thankfully a lot to choose from, though do note that some have specific conditions to maximize their potential. For her generally most recommended free option, there's the new Eternal Calculus, the Erudition light cone from Herta's store. It has better base stats than almost all 4 stars and gives a stackable attack bonus based on how many enemies are hit, which lasts until the next attack. Due to that trigger condition, this performs best at pure fiction or fights with 5 enemies. There's also a speed bonus by hitting 3 enemies. Superimpositions are purchasable just by playing the Divergent Universe mode regularly. For her other free alternatives, there's The Day the Cosmos Fell, though note that she needs to attack at least 2 enemies with quantum weaknesses to get its crit damage buff, and Seriousness of Breakfast, which needs the wearer to defeat enemies to stack its attack buff. With Gacha, her best option is the signature light cone Yet Hope is Priceless. It gives crit rate, a stacking follow-up attack damage bonus that requires 200% crit damage to fully max out, and a nice defense ignore buff for her ult and follow-up attacks, which is more potent with other defense ignore or shred effects. With all these bonuses and very high base stats, it's a fairly significant step up from everything else. If choosing between her E1 and S1, it really comes down to if you want the E1 stacking advantage or the simple bigger damage numbers. I would personally go for E1 since I prefer the added teammate and playstyle flexibility, but that might take more pulls to get, so that's up to you. If you got it from the standard banner, the Himiko light cone Night on the Milky Way is a pretty good runner-up 5-star and generally better than Calculus. But note as well that its attack buff depends on how many enemies are on the battlefield. You want Jade against a lot of enemies and in pure fiction content, you're easily maxing it out anyway, but otherwise, expect the damage output to be inconsistent depending on the enemy count. I also don't recommend buying it in the Starlight shop. If you're a regular Battle Pass buyer and plan to, or have an S5 Today is Another Peaceful Day, that's also a solid choice. It has higher base stats than other 4 stars and a permanent universal damage bonus based on the user's max energy, so that's a 56% damage bonus at S5 with her 140 energy. Other S1 5 stars and S5 4-star Erudition light cones perform very closely with one another and the previously mentioned options aside from her signature. At the end of the day, just consider what you have and their superimposition level. Just stay away from Make the World Clamor since that buffs ultimate damage only, and After the Charmony Fall since that buffs break effect. Now let's talk about Jade's team comps and synergies to note. Again, remember that teammates who can attack frequently with multi-target attacks, whether they can move really fast, have out-of-turn actions such as follow-up attacks, or both, will be ideal debt collector allies as they can most effectively generate Jade's follow-up attack stacks. You also don't have to restrict her to applying the debt collector on strictly DPS units since supports with offensive capabilities can be viable targets too. Pairing Jade with another AoE DPS like Himiko, Herta, or Argenti in pure fiction is basically an auto-win team. Himiko and Herta's AoE follow-up attacks perfectly synergize by charging Jade's follow-up attacks, which then leads Jade's follow-ups to either trigger breaks or reduce enemy HP to trigger Himiko and Herta's follow-ups, creating this insanely strong feedback loop. While Argenti doesn't have follow-ups, you can spam his low-cost ultimate and AoE skill instead. Clara is also a good combo with her frequent counter-attacks from getting hit. Blade also has natural synergy with Jade's debt collector HP drain. While affected, his attacks now generate 2 of his own stacks, which leads to triggering more frequent follow-up attacks. He's currently the one who can innately make the best use of this HP drain effect, but you can expect more units with similar gimmicks to release in the future that can utilize this, and hopefully more effectively. Purely single-target DPS teammates are much slower in stacking her follow-up attack charges, so at E0, it's not as advisable to make them debt collector teammates for Jade. However, that gets resolved if you have Jade's first Eidolon, which makes her viable and optimal teams a lot more flexible and makes her also more adaptable to other combat modes with fewer enemies. You can imagine teammates like Topaz and Dr. Ratio who can output fast consecutive attacks will now give 3 stacks per attack, which can lead up to crazy fast stack charging. Someone like Clara as well, whose follow-up attack is only single target if it isn't enhanced, will also be more effective. The same goes for fast supports with single target attacks like Pela and Gallagher. In a dual DPS setup, you generally want supports who can either provide team-wide buffs or debuff enemies to boost the damage of multiple teammates. Robin and Ruanmei are the best examples for strong team buffing with their unique advantages like Robin's team-wide advance and Ruanmei's break efficiency increase. Other 4-star team buffers like Asta or Yukong can work too, albeit less potently. Some Harmony buffers also have a mix of single target and team-wide buffs like Bronya and Sparkle. They can only target one ally to advance forward, but that can still work well even in a dual DPS Jade team, since they can target the debt collector to advance and help trigger Jade stacks faster. For debuffers, Pela is highly recommended as she can do a full AoE defense shred to maximize your team's AoE damage. Your sustain slot is also very flexible as long as it gets the job done at least, but there are those with extra useful utilities beyond simply sustaining your team that can be more effective. For example, Ho-Ho has her team attack buff and battery utility, Lynx can boost a destruction ally's aggro, Aventurine and Fushuan have crit boosting effects, offensive sustains like Gallagher and Luocha and even Aventurine can be potential debt collectors and can help contribute towards breaking weak enemies. Lastly, another more niche playstyle is a hypercarry team with Jade as the main DPS. You can either make a support ally the debt collector if they can frequently attack, and it's even more effective with E1 since most supports have single target attacks, or you can make Jade herself the debt collector, which doubles her basic attack and ultimate's charge stacking and relies on consistent advance forward effects to make her act faster. Bronya or Sparkle will be best at the job. It's not my top team template recommendation, but it is an option for those who are interested, and it can clear MOC well enough anyway. As always, these team discussions aren't exhaustive or definitive, so feel free to try your own teams and see what others might suggest. Finally, some observations regarding her auto battle behavior. If you're running a dual DPS team, then it's pretty straightforward as Jade seems to target the quote-unquote obvious second DPS. But if ever you have setups that involve targeting a more unconventional choice to be the debt collector, the auto battle might not be able to implement it as you intended. I then tried to see what happens with an advance forward ally in a dual DPS team. In my first test with Blade and Bronya was advancing Jade, whereas I hoped she would advance Blade instead. But for some reason I was able to make Blade the advanced target when I lowered his speed stat. I'm not really sure why there's this discrepancy, but that might be something you'll want to check in your case if you plan to use such a team. I was also curious what happens if Jade is in a hypercarry team and if she would actually target herself. It seems that as long as there are other allies with AoE attacking capabilities, Jade will prioritize them over herself, like Pela, Gallagher, Asta, and so on. It was only when I made a team with supports that only have purely single target attacks that Jade finally targeted herself. And that's going to be all for this guide on our lovely Lady Jade. Hopefully you won't get caught in her whip anytime soon, unwillingly at least. Let me know in the comments what you think of Jade so far and if you'll be pulling for her or not. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!